Hello and welcome to the Global Humanities Podcast, exploring Curtin University's education ecosystem from the perspective of our globally connected faculty. My name is Daryl Tynan and I am the International Recruitment Consultant in the Faculty of Humanities. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which Curtin University is located, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I am excited to be joined today by Dr. Yirga Woldijs, a senior lecturer in human rights in Curtin University's School of Media, Creative Arts and Social Inquiry, and a researcher at Curtin's Centre for Human Rights Education. Yirga Woldijs was born and raised in Ethiopia. After training and working for a time as a medical assistant, he followed his father's path to study law at university. He worked for grassroots organisations in Ethiopia before travelling to Perth to study his PhD at Curtin University. Dr. Woldijs teaches and researches on human rights with a view to areas of development, law, education, native colonialism, indigenous knowledges, and the importance of diverse lived experiences towards decolonial futures. He is a poet, author, translator, teacher, and has an extensive body of research and writing. Doctor, thank you very much for your time. It's good to have you here. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Can I start actually by ensuring that I'm getting your name pronounced correctly?
Yes, you have actually pronounced my name better than many people.
Okay. I have a tendency to move towards a Turkish accent sometimes with a Yirga, so I'm rolling the R a little bit. I don't know if...
That came across quite well.
Oh, okay. I forgive me, I don't know Amharic as a language very well, so I'm giving it a go. So you grew up in rural Ethiopia. Can you tell us more about where you were raised and what it was like?
Yes, sure. I grew up in a place called Lalibela, and it's a rural town, but also a very historical town, a place that had important historical significance in Ethiopia. It is well known for its rock-hewn churches. Around the 13th century, a king called Lalibela wanted to build heaven on earth. His idea was to give his people the experience of living in heaven while they are living on earth. So what he did was he decided to carve out these churches from a big rock, a rock as big as a village. And they started to carve the churches starting from the roof and cutting it down and creating 11 churches with tunnels and a beautiful architecture. Everything built and carved only from a single rock, and it still stands 800 plus years or 900 years.
I've seen photos and documentaries about it. It's one of the places, it's one of my bucket list of places to go and see in the world.
I think everyone should go and visit.
It must have been a fascinating place to grow up, though.
It is, because you know, like, it kind of gives you a sense that this world is not simply a collection of forests or animals, stone and dust. It actually has more importance to it. It has purpose, it has meaning, it has beauty. So the existence of those rock-hewn churches, which I believed to be like a kingdom of heaven on earth, where, you know, monks and nuns live in it, praying, and people go and visitors go and see it. It kind of instilled in me a sense of belonging that profoundly encouraged me to really see the world in a much more different way than I would if I were told to see the world as nothing but, you know, resources or something like that.
Really will have set up your mindset. Later on, what was your education like as a young man before you went to university? And maybe help us to understand what schooling is like where you grew up.
Yeah, because, you know, when I grew up, there are two types of schools in Ethiopia. The first one is the traditional school system, which was built in Ethiopia for centuries, because Ethiopia is the only country that was never colonized by the West.
Yes.
So it maintained its literature, its history, and had an education system that worked for centuries. And I was fortunate enough to go through that education system at the initial time of my growing up, and studied these ancient texts of how to write them, how to rehearse, remember them, and so on. And from that, then I moved into the formal government education system, where you will be sitting in classroom and a teacher will come and tell you everything that you need to know. Quite different from the type of education I had through the traditional education system.
Indeed.
Now, the difference is that the traditional system is not funded by the government. So if you continue studying in that system, you probably will end up not being employed. But your knowledge, your understanding, your character, and everything becomes quite relevant to the society. So early on, I kind of started to feel how education in Ethiopia was disconnected from people's experiences, from who they are, because it didn't really incorporate that experience that I know growing up in the rural farm, for example, studying in the traditional system and so on. So going to this government system, which we call it now a Western education system, because it simply imitates ideas and concepts from foreign countries and incorporate it into books and texts and the curriculum and teach students. And that was a system that I experienced studying and ended up criticizing later on after I came here.
I want to come back to all of these ideas of different forms of colonialism and how it's helped you to form your own ideas. I first want to just talk through your education a little more. You went on to study law in Ethiopia, like your father. That's, again, as you say, a very traditional. And I read that all of the law is done in English, whereas the entire country and the legal system is in Amharic. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Yeah. A strange disconnect going on there.
Yeah.
That must have been,
absolutely. Absolutely. It's really strange for so many people because when I went to school, my initial thought was, look, if I really study, I will become someone like Lalibela. When we're children, we're making, trying to carve churches. We're pretending to become like important people in our lives. And of course, we experienced a shortage of many things. Like, for example, there was no accessible or easy access to water, or there may not be enough things around, or shoes and so on. But those things that we didn't have did not really form our identity. They were simply inconveniences or missing things in our lives.
Right.
But when we go to school, we were educated that the life we lived was a life of poverty. So we gave it a name that became something which really disempowered us and made us believe that all we should do to change this poverty is to kind of accept everything that's given to us as education. So when education was brought to us in English, without considering our experience, we haven't had any reference to reject it. We had to accept it, and we had a socialist system. It was very brutal in framing and calling all the tradition we had as backward, barbaric, feudalistic, and so on. And we saw people killed for being, leaders for many, many years as traditional people, but they were framed as enemies of the revolution, feudalists, and so on. The paradox is that the people who brought violence to our country were people who were educated in the Western education system.
Yes.
These are not traditional people coming and committing violence. And the same is true actually across Africa, which we might talk about later, that a lot of violence that we see is instigated by people who kind of brought the wrong type of education to their people.
Indeed. And this gets me to the point that I was interested in. You, at some point, you finished your degree, you've worked in your home country, grassroots organization, trying to help your own people and be a part of that community. But then you've come to what is ostensibly a very Western nation for a very Western education. Now, some people may be aware that Australia was in itself colonized quite brutally, and to a certain extent, even the people, many of the white settlers were colonized in many ways. So what led you to come to a country that had that history of colonial dominance infused into it when you're having all these ideas and thoughts about what it is to be colonized?
Yeah, I think that's interesting because just to give you a little bit of my experience as well in what you mentioned about studying law and working in Ethiopia. As I continued to study in that system, I wanted to be good at it. I wanted to become a great writer because I had the passion for writing poetry. And when I went to university, I collected all the poems I had and went to this literature department and gave my poetry collection to a teacher, a professor there. And the professor looked at my work and said, have you read Shakespeare? Do you know about Hamlet? And he asked me questions I never knew. And no. And then he said, well, if you join our department, we'll teach you about these great writers and you'll become a better writer. And I felt like, well, this is not something I was expecting. I wanted to be perfect in the language and the experience that I know of. Then I decided to join the law school. And while studying law, I was also very active in clubs and literatures because the system is so closed to my experience. I started to explore new ways of bringing out my experiences. So that's why I started to engage with grassroots organizations, created a local NGO called AfroFlag, and started to teach with my friends there. And eventually, because I had family here in Australia, I ended up coming here to join them.
That's the link.
Yes.
That's the link.
My coming to Australia is actually because my family came over here before me, and I came to join them. But when I come here, I still didn't have a full understanding of colonialism, how it works. And
don't know that anyone could possibly. Yeah.
So it was so fortunate for me to find a place at Curtin University where I met with people who are sensitive about these issues, who really were open enough to explore ideas in a different way, even if they mean to contradict some of the things that exist in Australia. Even if it is about, for example, critically looking at the history of Australia, the lives of indigenous people in this country. So I found a place where, a concern for justice, for human rights is more important than anything else, any other loyalties. So that's how I came here and met with people at the Center for Human Rights Education, and I ended up studying my master's at the center.
Right.
So when I studied my master's, I started to think about this question about the relevance of education. The question was simply this: for a long time in our country, people were telling us that if we study more, if we create more schools, if more people go to schools, the country will be fine. We'll become a better people. Okay. If we bring in more investment, if more Westerners come to teach us and develop us, we will get better. But we have more schools today than ever before. We have more educated people today than ever before. We have more aid and investors coming into the countries, in Africa especially, than ever before. Why are our problems going deeply complicated and very difficult to solve? We see a lot of people leaving the continent, dying in Mediterranean seas. We see people migrating, violence is increasing everywhere. There's an ongoing racism. And so why is it all things happening if education was a solution? Why is the problem of Africa, or the problem of the world for that matter, but for the problem of Africa or Ethiopia, increases as education is expanding? And why is not education addressing these problems? So that was the central question that I tried to answer through my doctoral dissertation and doctoral study.
Were you able to answer it? Because I'm really interested now.
Well, I believe for a PhD dissertation, I believe I have given a well-considered response. And that response basically says that education has been an instrument of colonialism. Colonialism, in a sense, the colonization of the mind. When we think about Africa, we often think in terms of how, for example, slavery impoverished Africa or colonialism impoverished Africa. All of these things are true. But what we have forgotten as well is the colonization of the mind. how people are made to be disconnected from their experiences.
Indeed.
How their knowledges of how to raise children, have a family, farm the land, and everything is just regarded as primitive. And how modern development or modern education made it very easy to displace these people, to take away their land and give it to somebody else who has capital. And also to introduce ideas that are foreign to them. Take the example of Ethiopia. It's a country that was writing books when the British even didn't have the alphabet.
Indeed.
It has a strong history and tradition.
Extraordinary history and tradition.
But what is really remarkable is this country is reduced into this stage where the people are not even allowed to have education in their own languages. The education system is made in English. And even the degree that we write our papers for, or the masters or the PhDs, if you study it in Ethiopia, the rural farmers, my family, cannot read it because it's made in English. When I was trained as a lawyer, the laws in Ethiopia are made in Amharic, or when I graduate and go out, I would practice in the local language. My teachers, all of them speak the local language perfectly well.
Right.
But we were made to study in English. Now this is crazy. But this is how also we Ethiopians and Africans are incorporated into this global colonial system, which is still alive. Indeed. It just changed its face from slavery to colonialism, now to a face of neo-colonialism or neoliberalism, a system that utilizes people's minds to exploit themselves. So that is how we are incorporated, by kind of making people to study in a language that is not theirs and not be able to really transform their traditions, rather imitate others.
Part of your experience of learning about who you are, you talked about being an Ethiopian, wanting to be described as brown, as differentiated from red or black person in Ethiopia. But when you came to Australia, you said you learned more about the idea of blackness, about a subtlety you hadn't grasped previously. Could you talk through that journey a little bit, please?
Yeah, well, that's very interesting, because when I grew up in Ethiopia, we didn't have color consciousness, so to speak. You know, there's the skin color, other than identifying oneself as looking darker or brownish and so on, haven't had any significance in terms of telling the history, the intelligence, or the status of that person. So growing up in Ethiopia, and also the great thing that we have, because we haven't had colonialism, we haven't had white rulers in the country, is that we didn't have that color consciousness in the way other people understand whiteness and so on. Even to some extent, to be white is not associated with the skin color, but with other kind of derogatory meanings. But what really existed as a kind of manifestation of color was three things. One was you could become black or brown or red. So the classification is based on the role you would play in a game. And the game is like, if I'm brown, I will become a mediator, and the red and the black will be fighting. Okay. So I want to become brown all the time, and because I want to mediate rather.
You want to be the mediator.
But what is really interesting is when I went to university, there was this African American professor who came from American experience of racism and so on, and she was very inspired by Ethiopia's great history. But when she came to Ethiopia, she didn't really see people behaving as black in the way blackness is constructed in the West.
Right.
Yeah. So she wanted to really teach us about black consciousness or color consciousness. There was this club she was trying to create. And we went there, and we were very excited to get together by a professor who tried to bring us together. And then she was explaining how our blackness was important for who we are and so on. And one of my friends said, how about red? How about the brownish? We also know how to make mathematics and so on. Can we create a club for red consciousness or brown consciousness? Yes. That type of response shows you the level of disparity, the level of difference that we have in terms of how we understand identity. And for me, what we mean by black person, white person, and so on, emerges not from who we are biologically. You know, the fact is that one person is black or not black, biologically is not really important. what is important is the meaning that has in society. So when I come to Australia, I am defined as a black person, you know. So I cannot say that, oh, I'm brown though, I'm red. I cannot say that because the society imposes meaning on me. Now that is taking away the ability of a person to define, to say who he are. And in a context where there is racism, people of color do not have the freedom to say who they are or to become what they are, because their identity is imposed on them by a larger extent, not just by individuals, but by a system that requires them to develop certain values that are dominantly accepted by the white society. So you then I had to accept my blackness in that sense, because within my blackness exists all of those experiences that I come from in Ethiopia. That's poetries, the literature that I read, all of that experience exists within me. And I made it part of who I am as a black person here in Australia.
All of that is fascinating, and you had a wonderful introduction, a gateway into that. As a male white Australian who grew up in white-dominated Australia, and yet at the same time coming from a family legacy of working class, I was never aware of the colonialism that exists here and that can exist within the mind of many populations within Australia. You mentioned Australia's legacy of epistemic, structural and psychological violence that make up part of the formulation and continuation of Australia. Have you been able to explore those ideas further, and how do you take your knowledge from growing up in Ethiopia and these ideas of yourself and bring them into this conversation about Australia?
Yeah, I think that's a very fascinating question. That is a work in progress. I try to do that. And one of the things that is really interesting when we talk about growing up in Australia, for example, a country where there are indigenous people and there are all forms of issues around race, not just in Australia, but in every country where there are more European or white societies. It is a privilege not to know anything about racism. You can graduate and have a degree and become a lecturer without knowing enough about racism. So this racial illiteracy is not really regarded as anything important, because it's not the problem of the dominant society. That's what we mean. Sometimes it's called white privilege. It's privilege because colored people cannot avoid thinking about their identity.
Indeed.
But white people can be free. Not only that, they can also say that, I don't see color, because racism is not an individual choice. It is not someone who is, a bad guy who is insensitive to diversity, saying that, oh, these people are bad and we don't need to mix with them and so on. That is not the most important aspect of racism for me. Racism is a subtle, sometimes even a scholarly affair, because it is a system. It's a system that created, for example, if we look at the history of this country, the Constitution, and how indigenous people and the white community existed together in centuries, we can see that this was going on for generations, and enough has not been done yet in terms of recognizing indigenous people in the Constitution, in terms of consulting them and giving them voice, and all of that tells us that these things has not yet been addressed, and they need to be addressed for the benefit of everyone. So how do we really incorporate the importance of other voices from Africa, for example, from other experiences, is to just think in terms of what this mode of thinking about identity, about racism, is doing to the majority of Australians themselves. What does it make us be like? Think about, for example, the notion of identity that we have in terms of people who come from a European descent instead of people who are part of this indigenous history and legacies that existed for thousands and thousands of years. our inability to really connect with the land, with the history, with the people in this country, not just the good, but also the bad, not be able to go beyond our frame of thinking about our skin color or race and embrace that richness in this country, limits the possibility of the country to become greater than what it is now. As long as there are people who are unhappy in how they are being treated in this country is diminished by that level. So I think for me, racism is not really fixing the problem of black people. It's also addressing the problem of white people. It's also transforming everybody's thinking and life and creating a better future for everyone. So for that end, I bring in ideas that could help us really think differently about race. Instead of, for example, making our skin color identity at the center of our discourses, how can we really relate with one another based on experiences, lived experiences, and different ways of knowing the world?
Yeah, you talk at length, and I think one of your main ideas is the concept of the diverse lived experience and how it can decolonize us to a certain extent. How do you bring that into your teaching in the Master of Human Rights?
What I do in the Masters of Human Rights, which by the way, our Masters of Human Rights program is probably one of the unique programs in the world, because human rights is in many countries, even myself when I was studying law in Ethiopia, we study human rights only as a framework of the United Nations human rights system. Right. So we have the conventions, we have the treaties that we study, and we try to really find a way to implement them. But we ultimately also see that there is not as such an effective implementing mechanism or enforcement mechanism that put these things in place. Australia is the worst in that, because we don't have a system that incorporates this into the legal system in the country. So that is a very limiting way of, or a narrow way of understanding human rights, a legalistic framework that tries to apply it as it is. But what we do at the Center for Human Rights Education is quite different from a number of human rights areas. Of course, we consider the importance of the United Nations human rights system. I teach a unit called Human Rights Instruments and Institutions. In that unit, we introduce students with a simulation exercise. That means students would take roles of NGOs or government or the United Nations human rights bodies, and we make them do exercises based on those roles and come together to discuss on human rights issues. So we have a very practical way of introducing students with the United Nations human rights system, but we don't stop that. We have other units that bring in areas that help us rethink human rights. For example, there's a unit that I teach called Human Rights History Across Cultures and Religions. What I do in classes, I invite people from different religious backgrounds or religious scholars, from Muslim, from Buddhism, from Christianity, from Judaism, and so on. So these scholars come to class and teach the students about their religious thinking about human rights. And students are exposed to different ways of understanding the human and what is important for humanity from the perspective of that culture or tradition. And that is one example of learning about human rights from different phases, especially indigenous perspectives of human rights that we have. We bring in indigenous scholars or elders to teach students about their experience of human rights and what human rights mean to them. And we also have classes on transforming societies through activism, through involvement in communities. We have, our center is probably known for its work with refugees and asylum seekers in Australia, visiting detention centers, supporting asylum seekers in the country, and bringing their experience and working with them to class and sharing that with the students and learning about it. And that type of learning, I think, is quite important. We have studies about, for example, dialogue, consciousness rising, studies to critically think about the philosophy and history of human rights. Because in many places, you may study human rights using theoretical texts written by Enlightenment thinkers. That's the norm. But what we try to do is we try to base those ideas on how people live today. So I strongly believe that our ideas make sense only when they are relevant to how life exists in the world. So in kind of relating ideas with lived experience, we engage students with dialogue, and also that's also with how we assess them in terms of allowing them to write on topics that they are passionate about. For example, when I was doing my master's, I wrote most of my papers on the things that I know, on Ethiopia, on the people that I know of. And in my writing and engagement in the course, I was supported to explore how critically and more powerfully express the ideas that I believe are useful than being told an idea to write on. So that those are really important ways of learning that we have developed actually as a philosophy of our center here.
It sounds like a very positive way of moving forward. My final question for you today, I could keep talking like this for a long time, but I won't hold you up anymore. What is your favorite part of teaching?
My favorite part of teaching is really learning with and from the participants or the students. In a master's program that like ours, our students are graduates. Some of them even have PhDs, and they have enormous experience. But often they come to us because they are concerned about what's happening in the world. They want to become part of change for the good in the world. So when they come with knowledge. So what we do at the center is to open the platform, the space for them to explore their ideas. Education is often wrongly delivered in most parts of the world today. The mind of the students is often perceived as an empty bucket where the teacher can pour ideas into the mind and the student is there to absorb what the teacher would give them. But, overcoming that thinking, encouraging students to believe or to remember or to recognize that actually learning is their right. And it comes from their own experiences more than anybody else's experience. So encouraging them to take that role and share it with other students, with us, is a greater part for me. So it is a kind of a process of unlearning what we are accustomed to when we study in a traditional way of understanding texts or following the teacher.
Well, it sounds very inspiring and really interesting. Dr. Yirga Woldhuis, thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time, and it's been an eye-opening and wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
This has been the Global Humanities Podcast at Curtin University, and I will see you next time.